As I thought about the film afterwards, and even when I wasn't thinking about it, there were things that bothered me about it. I became more and more convinced that there is, in this film, a deeply laid subtext that takes on the Holocaust.
The Shining? That movie was about the genocide of the American Indian.
So if you watch those three things, you begin to understand this deeper story. The idea that Stanley Kubric was involved with faking the Apollo moon landings.
Room 237 is a fascinating documentary centered around Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The film documents the wealth of conspiracy theories that have emerged from different interpretations of the 1980s horror masterpiece, with different interviewees suggesting that the movie is everything from a story of sexual hedonism to an allegory of the genocide of the Native American people, to even a theory that the entire movie is actually a coded confession from Kubrick about how he helped NASA fake the moon landing. It's an enthralling watch, but while hearing so many theories makes it difficult to buy into any particular one, it does make one thing very clear. The Shining is a special movie. It has an abyss-like quality that draws people to its edges and compels them to stare down endlessly into its shadowy depths. And I'm very much one of them. The Shining terrifies me, and I've briefly documented the mild childhood trauma the film caused me in a previous video, but what I'd like to do today is try and dive a little deeper, and shed some light on what exactly about this movie is so frightening, and why so many people feel so compelled to try and uncover its deeper layers. Based on the 1974 novel written by Stephen King, if you've never experienced The Shining, the story of it goes like this. Recovering alcoholic and struggling writer Jack Torrance is employed to be the winter caretaker of the snowbound Overlook Hotel, a job that will require him, his wife Wendy, and his son Danny to stay in the massive building completely alone for all of winter. I think when you really look at it, there's three fundamental parts to The Shining story that make it so disturbing. The first is the sense of isolation it elicits and the anxiety that grows from that. The Torrances are completely alone in the Overlook, and while isolation in and of itself is unsettling, where it becomes frightening is that we're never more vulnerable than when we're alone, and The Shining plays directly into that fear. In the first 20 minutes of the movie, there's so many little subtle suggestions that something bad is going to happen. We're told that the previous winter caretaker went insane and murdered his wife and daughters with an axe. Even casual conversations seem to lead back to macabre ideas such as cannibalism and disturbed Native American burial grounds. There's the constant idea of violence and murder, and within that anticipation there's anxiety. We know the Torrances will be alone, completely vulnerable to the malicious force that's coming. But perhaps even more disturbing is how that malicious force manifests. As the weeks go by, Jack grows more and more unhinged, seeing people that aren't there and acting in bizarre, unsettling ways, until finally his madness escalates to the point that he makes the decision that he's going to murder his wife and child. There's no pleasant way of putting this, but at its core, The Shining is a story about a man harming his family, which is something so unnatural and awful, but also something that occurs every day. I think a lot of people tend to write Stephen King off as a pulpy horror writer, and I think that's not unwarranted in some cases, but he's at his best when he's exploring the everyday horror rooted in the human psyche. And Jack Torrance's desire to harm his family is maybe the best example of this. In his book, The Stephen King Companion, King wrote about how his own experience as a parent informed the writing of Jack Torrance. The protagonist is a man who has broken his son's arm, who has a history of child beating, who has beaten himself. And as a young father with 2 children, I was horrified by my occasional feelings of real antagonism towards my children. Won't you ever stop? Won't you ever go to bed? There are times when I felt very angry toward my children and have even felt as though I could hurt them. And so what the character of Jack Torrance is this very dark fear taken to a horrifying extreme. And I think this is what makes him such a genuinely unsettling character. As when you think about it, all he really is a deranged man with a sharp weapon, and horror cinema has no shortage of those. but it's his connection to his victims, his family, the people he's meant to care for and protect, that makes his gradual descent into madness and the resulting acts of violence so frightening. And it's the mere suggestion of this that makes some of the film's more low-key moments so profoundly disturbing.
You would never hurt Mom and me, would you?
What do you mean?
So if we stop there, these two factors alone are well enough to create a terrifying story, even separate from anything supernatural. But of course, there is a supernatural element to The Shining. The Overlook itself. It's the hotel that seems to be slowly twisting Jack's mind and tormenting the family with visions of blood-filled elevators and dismembered little girls. But I think an important aspect to the Overlook is the unusual way it interacts with the Torrances. Unlike a lot of the more typical haunted houses of horror cinema, the Overlook never directly engages with the family. It never performs any physical actions or harms a member of the Torrances, the only exception being the bruises Danny suffers from visiting room 237 and the door that opens by itself in the food cellar. But even those happen off screen and could be explained in other ways. Rather, what the hotel does seem to be trying to do is directly attack the sanity of its occupants, showing them things they don't want to see and quietly whispering to them in a variety of lurid ways. And it seems to be doing this with a distant, distinctly mocking glee. As it's not trying to murder the family, it's trying to get them to murder each other. And that is an infinitely more disturbing goal. Like the hotel is some massive, unknowable alien creature taking delight in slowly crushing the life out of its inhabitants. And I think this is a more effective way to think about the Overlook. It's not really haunted as much as it is alive. There's a malevolent consciousness to the hotel, nearly a Lovecraftian quality to it, as if the various entities that inhabit it aren't individual ghosts as much as they are tendrils of a much larger, more unknowable being. And that to me is infinitely more frightening. You would think with such a strong premise that when combined with Stanley Kubrick's expertise in filmmaking, you'd have an instant horror smash hit. But unusually, this wasn't actually the case, as The Shining was not especially well received when it released in 1980. The film suffered a lukewarm opening weekend, grossing significantly less than both The Omen and Alien, and was even panned by several prominent film critics. With Variety magazine writing in their review of the film, Kubrick has teamed with the jumpy Jack Nicholson to destroy all that is so terrifying about Stephen King's bestseller. The film was even nominated for 2 Golden Razzies, with Kubrick up for Worst Director and Shelley Duvall for Worst Actress. But that was nothing compared to the film's biggest detractor, Stephen King himself, who loathed the film, saying it carried none of the heart of the novel and that it destroyed the character of Jack and Wendy Torrance, calling the film cold, without heart, and misogynistic. But the quote that's always stood out to me the most is one King reportedly made of Kubrick after first seeing the movie, in which he stated, "I think he set out to make a film that hurts people." And I don't think at the time King had any idea just how right he was. The Shining is not an easy movie to watch. It has a slow, creeping dread to it that's quite difficult to get a hold of. Something about it just feels wrong. And to find an answer to why this is the case, I think we have to look at the very particular way The Shining was created. Generally, there's 2 rules of thumb when shooting horror cinema. Use of tight, angled close-ups to limit the audience's view of scenes, making them wonder what might be lying beyond the edge of frame, as well as lots of quick cuts to keep things feeling frantic when the scares actually do happen. And one thing that's so unusual about The Shining is how it leans away from both these conventions. Nearly the entire film was shot with an extremely wide-angle 18mm lens, which makes the spaces of the Overlook Hotel feel gigantic and overpowering. In a lot of the shots, the background completely engulfs the characters, drowning them in large amounts of empty space and constantly visually reinforcing the idea that these characters are alone, which ties back to the sense of isolation we talked about earlier, but but it also means that when something does appear, it's far more shocking and frightening. One of the reasons the hallway scene with the two little girls is so shocking is that we're confronted with something that shouldn't be there. At this point in the movie, the film spent nearly 40 minutes visually assuring us that this hotel is empty except for the Torrances, only to then shatter that assurance. And this is a fundamental fear The Shining plays upon, the unease that comes with people appearing in places they shouldn't be. But is also key in understanding the unease of how The Shining scares us, through subtle visual horror. While the film does have its more traditional scares, a lot of the unease of the movie comes from the very nuanced ways it shows us things. In most horror, we experience the scare at the moment of impact, usually at the same point the character does. But in The Shining, the characters will often notice something before the camera reveals it to the audience, which creates these little moments of intense dread and suspense. Just check out this first scene in the playroom and watch how long we hold on Danny's reaction before cutting to the scare. The Shining doesn't try to surprise us, rather, it clearly tells us something bad is going to happen and then it shows us. And I think the reason this approach works so well is that often what it does show us is something really genuinely horrifying, and one of my personal favourite instances of this is the infamous typewriter scene, where Wendy discovers what exactly Jack's been writing. Pages and pages and pages of the words, all work and no play, makes Jack a dull boy. And it's a moment that so brilliantly visually conveys something so horrifying, that the person Wendy loves and the only other adult in the hotel has gone truly, irrevocably insane. This same penchant for deeply unsettling visual horror carries through even to the portrayal of its actors. If you look at the big film stars of the 70s and 80s, many of them had a clean, crisp, polished look to them, with an acting style that tended to be far more reserved than what you'd see today. But by contrast, Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson have an upsetting, nearly dishevelled quality to them. And this was very much an intentional decision by Kubrick. Many of the close-ups were shot with the same 18mm lens that the wide shots were done in, and when a wide-angle lens is used to shoot close-up on a face, it has this effect of elongating the focal plane of the image, making the facial features look distorted and strange. And the film's use of this technique creates an uncomfortable, nearly uncanny look to the actors. And I think this is so interesting because so often horror movies will cast very conventionally good-looking actors in an effort to add to the voyeuristic or fantastical elements of horror cinema. But in consciously distorting the appearance of its actors, The Shining takes away that element of fantasy and replaces it with a quality that feels uncanny and strange. And this disquieting feeling is only enhanced by the performances of the actors. There's an upsetting quality to the acting of both Nicholson and Duvall in this movie. Parts where Nicholson comes across as genuinely hateful and deranged, and Duvall seems legitimately terrified. And the reason for this can be found in an interview with Ray Lovejoy, the editor of The Shining, where he talked about how Kubrick would shoot dozens and dozens and dozens of takes of each individual shot, some going well into the triple digits. And later on, when Lovejoy was going through take after take, he'd watch the actors grow slowly more unhinged as they became exhausted and ran out of conventional ways to portray their actions. Until around 30 or 40 takes in, they'd start acting in bizarre, unbalanced ways, speaking in unusual voices and contorting their faces into unsettling expressions. And invariably, these were the takes that would get used in the final cut for the movie. And I think this is apparent in the film itself. There's a genuinely unsettling aspect to the acting of The Shining, and I think this is why both Nicholson and Duvall were heavily criticised on the release of the movie, being seen as unrealistic and cartoonish, but also why their performances come across as so disturbing and so well remembered today. So, what this comes down to is every part of The Shining's visual direction is specifically designed to unnerve us. And when combined with the film's soundtrack, the unique, haunting atmosphere that's so synonymous with the film is formed. A lot of the tracks of The Shining barely even resemble music as much as they do a cacophony of lurid sounds, designed to seep into our subconscious and whisper to us that something is very wrong. There's one instance of this towards the middle of the movie that I really love. It's about an hour in when the hotel really starts to take control of Jack, and there's this deep thudding heartbeat mixed beautifully into the creeping background ambience. And it really gives weight to that feeling that the hotel is some massive, living, pulsing entity.
You mean just leave the hotel?
The sound of The Shining is uncomfortable, it's hard to listen to, but this is emblematic of how the film was made. When Stephen King called The Shining a film to hurt people, he was right, as every piece of music, every camera angle, every subtle inflection of dialogue is engineered towards causing its audience emotional distress. And as a result, it creates a kind of horror completely alien to anything else in the genre. And I think this is the reason why it garnered such a critical backlash when it was first released. People just didn't know how to process it. And I think even a slightly different take on the source material could have resulted in a dramatically different piece of media. And thankfully, for our purposes, that piece of media exists. Stephen King's The Shining is a 3-part made-for-TV miniseries released in 1997, the goal of which was presumably to create an adaptation that fell more in line with the original book, which I think is a fair objective. Kubrick's version of The Shining dramatically altered major parts of the book's story, and the novel itself is a fantastic piece of horror writing. And for what it's worth, the 1997 version is actually successful in this regard. It's a far more faithful adaptation, but it's also a far weaker piece of horror. If we were to boil down the key differences between the two versions, it would come down to 2 factors: atmosphere and ambiguity. The 1997 version was shot in the Stanley Hotel, the actual hotel Stephen King stayed at that originally inspired the story of The Shining. And while I'm sure that means a lot to King personally, its small, cramped spaces just don't elicit that same sense of isolation and emptiness that's so palpable in the original film. It looks more comforting and cozy than anything else. And likewise with the actors. While Nicholson and Duvall were both styled to look unnerving, the new cast, well... you get my point. And you know, maybe these aren't the most important aspects of the miniseries to focus on, but atmosphere is created through detail and nuance, and the total lack of either in the more granular aspects of the miniseries production leads to an adaptation that feels flat, without depth or subtlety, and a lack of subtlety leads us directly into our second factor, the ambiguity. Ambiguity is what drives a lot of the horror in Kubrick's The Shining. The concept of ghosts and the supernatural is used so carefully and in such a particular way that it leaves room for you to question if the hotel is actually haunted at all, or is the family just going collectively insane. But the 1997 version does not leave the same room for interpretation. Possibly the best examples of this is how both versions interpret the sections of the book featuring the man in the wolf mask. In the 1980s version, he appears towards the end of the film just as the tension is reaching its climax. And this happens. It's a bafflingly out-of-place shock to the system, given no context or even a hint of explanation. It just appears and then it's gone. Now, check out this same scare interpreted by the 1997 version.
Let me by.
Nowhere! I'm gonna eat you, Danny. I'm gonna start from the toes and just work my way up.
And for the record, this is much closer to how it is in the book, but what really strikes me about this interpretation is how hard it's trying to establish the Wolfman as a direct physical threat to Danny, and the result is that it's so ham-fisted it's nearly kind of comical. Whereas in the 1980s version, the threat is so hidden and so ambiguous that our brains go into panic just trying to identify it. The miniseries is more committed to the act of violence as opposed to the threat of violence. Jack's even successful in harming both Danny and Wendy at various points in the miniseries, which is unlike Kubrick's version, in which Jack never actually inflicts violence on either member of his family. But it's the threat of that violence and how clearly it's conveyed that the 1980s film actually ends up feeling like a far more violent version, despite there being only 2 instances of it on screen. And by contrast, the way the 97 version communicates its horror just feels clumsy and excessive. There's spooky furniture that moves by itself, the actors wear silly ghost makeup, and there's some really truly unfortunate hedge monster CG. And it ends up feeling so much more safe, neutered, and dated than the film that came 17 years before it. If the 1980s version of The Shining was made to hurt people, then this version just feels made for TV. But I think it also highlights what makes the original so special. That ambiguous, intangible atmosphere that's the result of every tiny part of the movie working on such a granular level, which creates this amazing feeling that there's something more to the story of The Shining, something sinister and unknowable lying just out of reach. And personally, I think it's people trying to understand this feeling, this intangible second layer, that's resulted in a lot of the bizarre theories that surround The Shining. And I'm not here to debate the validity of these conclusions, because what's more interesting to me is the sheer facts that they exist at all. The fact that there's still to this day people trying to break down this movie. I think the effectiveness of a piece of horror can be measured in how long the experience stays with the viewer after the credits have rolled. And The Shining is unparalleled in this regard. It's a film that haunts people. A movie that through its meticulous construction creates a tiny macabre world that's so easy to get lost in. And I think this is why people like myself and so many others are equally terrified and captivated by this movie. Its ability to creep into our subconscious and manipulate us on the subtlest possible level, creating a kind of horror that stays with you, trapping us in its dark corridors, and never letting us go. Friends, thank you for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed the first of our horror-themed videos for October. Also, a small announcement: if you're in Dublin on the 11th of November, I'm going to be attending Jcon, who are kind enough to invite me as a special guest. So if you're around, do come by and say hi. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for this video, who as ever make this channel possible. And if you'd like to be one of them, you can do so over at patreon.com/supereyepatchwolf. This week, I'd like to personally thank Scowl, Adam Barker, Hijam Najim, Axel Berger, BagelNet, Ian Betancourt, LM2 Photo, Wong Mun Hin Melvin, Digit777, Brian M. Walsh, Amanda Howe, and Urban Madman. As ever, you can find me over on the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast or on Twitter @eyepatchwolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.